Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is a crisis at our southern border. It is a crisis that Secretary McAleenan shared with this body repeatedly starting back in February. It is a crisis that House Democrats have ignored, and it is even a crisis that the Democratic whip laughed at. I repeat, laughed at on January 9th when asked whether there was a humanitarian crisis. To solve the crisis, we need to change our asylum laws. We need to erect physical barriers on the border, and we need a common sense immigration enforcement regime that allows for interior enforcement of our immigration laws and support for Customs and Border Patrol and ICE. These statements didn't used to be controversial. Just way back in the 1990s, the distant 1990s, Democrats included in their official platform that criminal illegal aliens needed to be deported. And obviously, you need the elements of ICE to be able to do that, and you need strong CBP to ensure that we have a secure border. But now, some on the radical left have substantially moved the Democratic Party in a dangerous direction. They say that interior enforcement of our immigration laws is racist. They say that building a wall is racist. And despite the fact that a substantial percentage of the brave Americans who work at ICE and CBP are of some minority status, there are claims that these institutions of ICE and CBP are in and of themselves racist. Those claims are absurd. These are patriotic Americans doing all they can to be helpful. But I wonder, where are we in this Congress? Where are House Democrats? Because as I've seen the new spokespeople for the Democratic Party, the Squad, step forward and call for the abolition of ICE, the abolition of the Department of Homeland Security, and the abolition of Customs and Border Patrol, I wonder, what elements of the securing of our border or the enforcement of our immigration laws would any of you even stand to support? And so I bring this amendment, largely demonstrably, to see who among the Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee agree with the most radical fringe on the Democratic left. So this amendment would do as the Squad has called for. It would abolish CBP. And I'd like to know who among you stand with the brave Americans who toe the line, who work the border, who enforce our laws, and who among you stand with the Squad. I can't wait to find out, and I certainly hope that my Democratic colleagues will not use procedural maneuvers to block consideration and to figure out which side of the line you're on. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Of his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I am so encouraged that earlier in this hearing, Chairman Nadler, on behalf of all members on the committee, indicated that you stand with the proposition of a maintained CBP entity within our government and that you stand against the position of the Squad, which has been repeatedly identified as seeking to abolish the Department of Homeland Security, CBP, and ICE. So thank you so much for standing with the good people of CBP, that they need to be able to continue to exist and do their important work. Thank you for speaking out against the Squad, and I truly appreciate the Chairman, in response to my prior amendment, indicating that every member of the Judiciary Committee on the majority side would oppose the abolition of CBP, and that is merely the view of the Squad. This amendment I think builds on that opportunity for consensus by expressing that the sense of Congress is that the legislation requires additional resources for CBP to engage in the activities that the majority seeks to delineate in the bill, and thus, in order to ensure that CBP is able to execute on what the majority seeks, it is merely the sense of Congress that there is supplemental appropriation necessary. I would caution my majority members, please don't fall into the trap that your own whip, Mr. Clyburn, fell into by not recognizing the need for supplemental appropriation. I'll remind you again that it was January 9th of this very year where Mr. Clyburn was asked whether or not there was a humanitarian crisis on the border. And his response was jovial laughter and then the assertion that there absolutely was not a crisis. It is my expectation that because you refuse to fix our asylum laws, you refuse to enhance physical structures and barriers on the border, you refuse to engage in solving the root problems of this mass movement of people illegally frequently into our country, that at least you would join us in expressing the sense of Congress that CBP would require supplemental funding. It is my prediction that months from now, we will still be in the same place. We will still have tens of thousands of people every few weeks that are illegally entering our country. And so please don't vote against this and then later come back and say that it was really Democrats all along that understood the crisis and that understood the need for this important supplemental funding for CBP. The folks at CBP, I've spent time with them. I've gone to the border. I know many of my colleagues in the majority and in the minority have done the same. They are truly besieged with a crisis that they are not equipped to handle. And I appreciate that while I disagree with some of the assumptions in the underlying legislation, at least the majority is working to try to acknowledge the crisis. At least the majority isn't taking the same position that Mr. Clyburn took, which is laughing at the notion of a crisis. But acknowledging it is not enough. We actually have to ensure that we have the resources available. And so this will be a moment in time. Did you agree that we need to continue to fund CBP, or is there going to be regression from the standard that the chairman expressed earlier, and are you going to regress more to the positions of the squad in demonizing the great people who work at Homeland Security, ICE, and Border Patrol? Join us, stand with them, and recognize the need for additional funding to deal with this crisis, or face the extreme high likelihood that you will have to be fed back your own words and your own actions yet again in this committee, as my good friend, my colleague from the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, said were psychological operations at our last committee hearing, because we simply wanted to refresh the words of the majority's own leadership to them. I hope you'll join me in the amendment.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will.
I don't underestimate the gentleman's passion for his commitment, as we all have on this side of the aisle, for the right kind of care at the border and the right kind of funding. I will remind the gentleman that we just appropriated $4.6 billion. That is added on to the normal appropriations for DHS. But let me, as a friend, take issue with the fact of mention of members who are not in this room. I take issue with the laughter alleged by Whip Clyburn. I don't have.
I'm going to reclaim my time for my remaining few seconds.
And take issue.
I'm sorry, Madam. I'm sorry. I control the time.
Use of the word
I control the time.
I don't know what the word quad means.
Because I control.
I yield back to the gentleman.
It is the gentleman's time, and he has 5 seconds restored.
It was not an allegation of laughter. It was playing the gentleman's own laughter. And so, like, you guys can't laugh at our claims of a crisis, and then when you're fed back the laughter,
Gentleman's time
assert
has
that it wasn't
expired.
laughter.
The gentleman's time has
belies logic. I yield back.
The gentleman's